Rejection, the dismissing or refusing of a proposal, idea, or person. This noun is an inevitability of life, but most of us do our best to avoid it. And despite this, all of us want to be successful, have the opportunities to fulfill our potential in terms of our health, wealth, and happiness. When you look closely, you'll see that any successful person there has ever been has gone through all kinds of rejections, some huge, some small, but they somehow always keep going. And a lot of people assume that these very successful people are just immune to rejection, that it's like water off a duck's back. But the truth is that for even the most persevering, rejection is a bitter pill to swallow. And the sad truth, whether we like it or not, is that rejection is part of life. And it's a key cornerstone of building resilience. And resilience comes from being able to handle and deal with rejection. And so today's video is the second in our series, Lessons in Resilience. And we'll be looking at someone who's faced more rejections than most in the pursuit of his dream. And despite this has not prevented him from becoming perhaps the most prolific person in his entire industry. The author, Stephen King. We all know Stephen King as one of the most successful authors of all time. He has had 66 books published, and there have been over 50 film adaptations of his work, including the likes of The Shining, The Green Mile, The Shawshank Redemption, Misery, and It. He is without question one of the greatest storytellers of all time. But it wasn't always that way. Before his endless snowball of successes, King was like many other struggling writers. In his memoir on writing, he revealed that as a teenager, he would submit countless short stories to magazines. And from the hundreds he would send, he'd invariably be sent back his original story alongside a standardized rejection slip. But interestingly, rather than scrunch these up, tear them up, or throw these in the bin, what King decided to do was hammer a nail into his bedroom wall. And he would pierce through every single rejection slip that he ever got. And it got to the point after a few years where this nail could no longer support the weight of all these rejection slips, so he actually had to replace it with a firmer spike. And ultimately it took him 6 years from that first rejection slip to then actually getting his first story published in a magazine. And while King didn't really expand as to exactly why he did this, I think there's a key lesson in resilience that we can all take away from it. That we need to all confront rejection head on. You see, this growing mass of rejection slips would have acted for King as a daily reminder of the fact that he hadn't yet made it, but that he was actually doing what he needed to do in order to make it, and that was keep writing. But a lot of us will try to avoid and repress the pain that actually comes with rejection. But actually, it's this pain and frustration that ends up being one of the best sources of motivation, because it's a signal that something needs to change. So actually having some form of continual reminder to indicate that rejection, it can actually allow you to plow on until you find that acceptance that you're looking for. But even for Stephen King himself, there were various setbacks that not even this stack of rejection slips could help him overcome. In his early adult years, he still desperately wanted to make a living as a writer, but he had to compromise and take a teaching job, given he had 2 small children and a wife to look after. So he'd write in his spare time. He continued to have very little success, so began writing something a little bit different, a short story titled Carrie. But this piece ended up giving him a lot of headaches. He struggled to convince himself because he was writing as a man from the perspective of a teenage girl. And with these frustrations continuing to grow, he decided to throw the draft of Carrie in the bin. But the next day he found that his wife had pulled out this draft from the bin, and she read it and thought it was actually really good. And she said that she would help him convey more of a realistic presentation of a teenage girl. So King persisted, and Carrie ultimately took 9 months for him to write, and it was rejected by over 30 publishers before being published in 1974. It was his first published novel, and it went on to sell over 1 million copies in its first year as a paperback, and became an Academy Award nominated film in 1976, but King himself had come to reject it. So what's also essential when it comes to overcoming rejection is that you must surround yourself with supportive others. King has always had this with his extraordinary wife Tabitha, and he's also fortunate to have a mother who would pay him $1/4 a time to write stories for her and his aunts. There are times that all of us lose hope and belief, and it's in those times that we need our social rocks of support to hold us up. No one can succeed without a number of key others rooting in their corner. And despite his subsequent reel of successes, King realised that for all his hits, they only came about because of so many misses. He would use rejection as an opportunity to learn, and even if that meant learning something so trivial and basic. And this is nicely demonstrated again in his memoir on writing, in which King details the time in which he received his first ever personalised rejection slip. It bluntly said, "Don't staple manuscripts. Loose pages plus paperclip equal correct way to submit copy." And King initially thought this was very cold advice. But then he thought, well, actually it's useful in some way. And never again did he send a manuscript with staples in it. You see, that level of bluntness would crush a lot of people after spending day after day, week after week, sometimes even month after month, honing something that you've really poured your heart and soul into, to then get something so disconnected and so detached. But that response is one based off of assumptions, that you think that person is heartless, that they're a. But King learned that these reviewers at magazines and publishers spent their entire day having to read through countless pieces. In most cases, they didn't even have the time to respond whatsoever. So getting some form of practical advice was actually very useful. And from King's response, we learn a final lesson that we should all take away. That we should deal with rejection practically, but not personally. In many contexts, it's far more important to focus on the practicality of rejection in terms of the how and why it occurred and why something wasn't accepted. And this is far more productive than focusing on the what of rejection, usually in terms of what does this person think of me? Because most of the time they probably don't think anything of you. And that means neither good nor bad, so it can't really be personal. It's just that we haven't practically met the requirements of something. So the onus is on us to try and understand and learn from this, instead of self-deceiving ourselves in thinking that a rejection was personal and it was about something to do with our character. Stephen King is without question today a creative genius who seems to have an endless conveyor belt of captivating stories running through his brain. But he's only gotten to this point because of developing resilience by being able to handle and use rejection to his advantage. A lesson that we should all learn from.